Hey everyone, this PowerPoint is on Chapter 11 on muscles of the body, just some general characteristics that will be included on your next lecture exam. So the muscular system refers specifically to the skeletal muscles. These are the muscles that make up the flesh of the body and produce many types of movements like the blinking of an eye, standing on your tiptoes, swallowing food, as well as breathing. Now, skeletal muscles attach to the bony skeleton, and contraction of these muscles do result in body movement. So there are a number of physical parameters that define how a muscle acts on the bony skeleton. So for example, we have arrangement of fascicles. We know that fascicles are bundles of muscle fibers aligned in different patterns. Now, the arrangement of these fascicles influences muscle movement as well as force of the muscle. We have lever mechanics. So muscles use levers to aid in the movement of objects, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. And then we have muscle actions as well as interactions. So muscles are classified into functional types. For every one type of muscle or muscle group that produces an action, there is another type or group that produces the opposite action. So first we're going to talk about muscle fascicle arrangements. So we know that skeletal muscles consist of bundles of fibers, also known as fascicles. These are aligned in different patterns, and the arrangement of these fascicles will influence the amount of movement produced when the muscle shortens, also known as the range of motion, as well as the amount of force produced, or the power. So we know that skeletal muscle fibers can shorten up to about a third of their resting length as they contract. Now, muscles with more parallel fibers, or fibers that are parallel to the long axis of the muscle, have a greater range of motion but are not as powerful. Power actually depends on the total fibers that the muscle contains. So the more fibers means more power. So muscle fascicles are actually aligned in different patterns. These patterns include circular, convergent, parallel, and pennate. And with pennate, we have multipennate, bipennate, and unipennate. And we can see examples of this on the next slide. So first we're going to talk about the circular pattern. These are when fascicles are arranged in concentric rings, sort of like the rings you see in a tree trunk. So types of circular patterns surround external body openings, which they can close with contraction of these muscles. Now, a general name for a circular muscle is a sphincter, but we do have more specific examples. For example, the orbicularis oris muscle, which surrounds the mouth, and contraction of this muscle helps with closure of the mouth. The next type of pattern is the convergent pattern. This is where the origin of the muscle is broad. The fascicles will then converge toward the tendon of the insertion of this muscle. The muscle can be triangular or fan-shaped, and then muscle fibers will extend along the length of the muscle from origin to insertion. An example of this is the pectoralis major muscle of the anterior thorax, which we've seen in our cadavers, and which we will be going over this unit, or we have gone over this unit during our dissection period. So here we see a convergent pattern of our muscle fascicles, where we see this fan-shaped muscle, and all the fibers converge upon the tendon where the muscle inserts. So example of this again is the pectoralis major muscle. Another arrangement that we talked about is the parallel arrangement. So this is when the long axis of the fascicles will run parallel to the long axis of the muscle. The muscle fibers will extend from origin to insertion. Now, the muscle arrangement can be fusiform. So fusiform meaning it has tapered ends and then an expanded central belly. An example of this is the biceps brachii muscle of the arm. Parallel arrangement type of muscles can also be strap-like. For example, the sartorius muscle of the lower limb. Now, the more parallel the muscle, the greater the range of motion. However, it will not be as powerful. So again, examples of the parallel arrangement, we see fusiform arrangement, such as the biceps brachii muscle in the arm, and then we see a long strap-like muscle like the sartorius muscle in the leg. The next pattern is the pennate pattern. So with this pattern, the fascicles are short and attach obliquely to a tendon. Looks much like a feather. So we have different types of pennate patterns depending on how many feathers we see. For example, a multi-pennate muscle, you can see many feathers side by side with all their quills inserting into one large tendon. So an example of this would be the deltoid muscle in the arm. With bipennate, fascicles insert into the tendon from both sides. So an example of this is the rectus femoris muscle of the thigh. So we see two sort of feathers here along the sides of the feather. And then a unipennate fascicle will insert into only one side of the tendon. So here we see a unipennate muscle. And here is the tendon. So an example of this would be the extensor digitorum longus muscle that can be found in the anterior leg. Now again, the power of the muscle depends on the total number of fibers. So the stocky bipennate and multipennate muscles contain the most fibers. They shorten very little but tend to be most powerful. So another characteristic that we're going to talk about with regards to muscles is the lever system. So this is a relationship between bones and muscles. Now, the operation of most skeletal muscle involves leverage. With leverage, you use a lever to aid the movement of some object. A lever is a rigid bar that moves on a fulcrum. Now, a fulcrum is a fixed point. When an effort is applied to the lever, a load is moved. In the body, we can relate bones as being the levers. Joints are the fulcrums, and the effort is exerted by skeletal muscles that pull on their insertions. And we have different types of levers in the body. So the first type of lever is the first class lever. This is when we see the fulcrum in the middle of the load and effort. So here's the fulcrum here. Here is the lever, and we can see the load on one side and the effort being exerted on the other side. An example of this would be a seesaw or a pair of scissors. So a first class lever system in the body, for example, can raise your head off your chest. So the posterior neck muscles will provide the effort. And then the atlanto-occipital joint between the bottom part of the base of the skull, as well as the joint in the atlas, that cervical bone, functions as the fulcrum. And the weight to be lifted is the facial skeleton. So here we see the fulcrum here, that joint between the base of the skull and the atlas, that cervical bone, and the effort being exerted by the posterior neck muscles to lift up the facial skeleton. Okay, so that is an example of a first class lever. Now, with a second class lever, the load is in the middle of the effort and the fulcrum. So here we see the fulcrum at one end, the load in between the fulcrum and the effort, which is at the other end. An example of this would be a wheelbarrow. So here we see the fulcrum of the wheelbarrow, and then the effort being exerted on the other end with the load being between the two. Now, example of a second class lever would be when you stand on your tiptoes. So the effort is exerted by the calf muscles pulling upward on the heel. The joints of the ball of the foot are the fulcrum, and the weight of the body is the load. So that is an example of a second class lever. With a third class lever, the effort is actually in the middle of the load and fulcrum. An example of this are a pair of tweezers. So here you see the fulcrum, the load on the other end, and here is the effort in the middle of or between the load and the fulcrum. Now, usually effort is applied closer to the fulcrum than the load. An example of this in the body is when you flex the forearm by the biceps brachii muscle. So effort is exerted on the proximal radius of the forearm. The fulcrum is the elbow joint. And the load is the hand and distal end of the forearm. Now, this provides a mechanical disadvantage because it requires a large effort just to move a small load. So with regards to muscle actions and interactions, skeletal muscles are arranged in opposing groups across movable joints. One group of muscles can reverse or modify the action of the other, and we kind of talked about these different actions, these opposing actions in the earlier part of this course. So muscle groups are classified into functional types. We have prime movers, also known as agonists. We have antagonists, and we have synergists. So prime movers are also called agonists. These are the muscles that are responsible for a particular movement. Antagonists will produce the opposite or reverse movement. Now, the relationship between prime mover and antagonist can actually be interchangeable depending on the primary movement. So, for example, flexion of the arm by the pectoralis major muscle is antagonized by the latissimus dorsi muscle. However, if we're talking about the opposite action, which is extension, the latissimus dorsi muscle is the primary mover for extension of the arm, which is then antagonized by the pectoralis major muscle. Now, synergists are actually muscles that help the prime movers. They can prevent undesirable movements or even stabilize joints. So muscle action can be determined by the position of the muscle relative to the joint it crosses. So we've talked about flexion before. Flexion is when the muscle crosses the anterior side of a joint. Extension is when the muscle crosses the posterior side of the joint. Abduction, abduction, crosses the lateral side of the joint away from the midline, and we know that adduction, ADD, crosses the medial side or goes towards the midline of the body. So here we see some representations of those movements. Again, we can see the pectoralis major here, and we see the muscle that crosses on the anterior side of a joint produces flexion. So here we see flexion of the arm, and the joint being the shoulder. Okay, and then here we see the latissimus dorsi posteriorly. We see that the muscle will cross on the posterior side of the shoulder joint, going posteriorly, so that produces extension. Then we see the deltoid muscle right here, crosses on the lateral side of the joint, and that causes abduction, abduction, away from the midline. And then we see the teres major muscle. It crosses on the medial side of the joint, and this helps with adduction or adding to the midline of the body. Now, another important thing about this chapter includes the criteria for naming muscles. And we've kind of gone over this in lab, but this should help you moving forward when you are identifying the different muscles that we will be going over in the subsequent labs. So there are different criteria for naming muscles. So we can name muscles based on location, shape, relative size, direction of fascicles and fibers, location of attachments, the number of origins, as well as muscle action. So with regards to location, we know that location can indicate where a muscle is located. For example, we talked about the brachialis muscle in the arm. So brachium means arm. So brachialis muscle is a muscle in the arm. Intercostal muscles. We know that the intercostal muscles lie between the ribs. Costa is the word meaning rib. For shape. So some muscles are named for their shape. We know that the deltoid muscle is a triangular muscle. The right and left trapezius muscles together form a trapezoid. For relative size, we have words such as maximus, which means largest, minimus, which means smallest, and longus, which means long, and brevis, which means short. So we're going to encounter the gluteus maximus muscle. This is the largest muscle within the gluteal region. We've seen the adductor pollicis brevis muscle. Again, that muscle having a very short muscle fiber. Another way of naming muscles include the direction of fascicles and fibers. The names will tell you the directions that the muscles will run. So for example, rectus. Rectus means straight. An example of this is the rectus femoris muscle that we'll see in the lower limb. We have transversus and oblique, which means that the fascicles will lie at a right angle, at an oblique angle to the midline. So when we get into the muscles of the abdomen, we have the transversus abdominis muscle as well as the external oblique muscle of the abdomen. Another way of naming muscles includes the location of attachments. So the names of the muscles will reveal their points of origin as well as insertion. In the arm again, we talked about the brachioradialis muscle. So we know that this muscle will originate on the bone of the brachium or arm, which we know to be the humerus, and then will have its insertion on the radius. Another criteria for naming muscles includes the number of origins. So in the arm again, we have biceps. Bi means two. So biceps implies that it has two heads. Triceps has three heads, and quadriceps has four heads. So the name of the number of origins is in the number. So for example, biceps brachii has two origins. Triceps has three origins, and so forth. And lastly, another way to name skeletal muscles is by its action. So muscles are named for what they do. In the arm again, we talked about flexors, extensors. We've seen adductors and abductors. Examples of this include the muscles that we've seen in the muscles of the anterior and posterior forearm. So these next couple of slides include some root words to remember. These are actually pretty important because we are going to get into a lot of muscles in the next couple of units. So kind of going over these root words will help you identify structures. So just some important ones that I put in these slides include seps. So seps means head. We've seen the biceps and the triceps. So bi means two, seps means heads. So biceps has two heads. also indicates the number of origins, as per the last slide. Delta. Delta means triangular, so we've seen the deltoid muscle in the shape of a triangle. Dia means across. So for example, the diaphragm is a muscle that goes across the body, that separates the thoracic area from the abdominal area. And then we have gastro or gastro. This means belly. We'll see the gastrocnemius muscle in the lower limb. Genial means chin. Glute means buttock or rump. Gracile means slender, so we'll see the gracilis muscle in the lower limb, which is a slender muscle. Isthmus means superlative or the most, so we have the latissimus dorsi muscles. Other roots to remember is fram, not fragum, but fram. This is a partition, so the diaphragm is a partition that goes across the body, again, separating the thorax from the abdomen. Psoas means loin. We'll have psoas muscles within the pelvic area. Quad means four. Rectus means straight. We have many muscles that have the word rectus in it. For example, the rectus abdominis muscles within the abdomen, rectus femoris muscles within the anterior thigh. Rhomb means diamond shape. We have the rhomboid muscles, a rhombus major, rhombus minor muscles. Sartor means tailor. There's a sartorius muscle in the lower limb. Semi means half. Serrate means saw. So we have the anterior and posterior serratus muscles that kind of have a sawtooth shaped appearance. Teres means round. We have the teres major and teres minor muscle. We know that the teres major muscle is an important muscle because it is an important landmark for the separation or where one part of the artery in the arm ends and one begins. Something for you to review for the upcoming exam. Trapeze means trapezoid shaped, so we have the trapezius muscles, and vastus means large. So we have the vastus muscles that make up the quadriceps in the anterior thigh. Vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, all large muscles of the anterior thigh. Okay, so this was a relatively short lecture. I didn't want to add too much information to the upcoming lecture exam. You've already been lectured on all the topics that, will be on the lecture exam. So just add a few more slides to your studying, and then if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Hope you've enjoyed this lecture video. There will be many more to come. All right, thanks a lot.